There are 5 workshops in the Writing at the Graduate Levels series. Each of these workshops includes a Blackboard component. If you decide to complete the Blackboard component, you will be eligible after all 5 for a Writing at the Graduate Level certificate. As you go along in this workshop, we have several moments in which we have reflections and questions for you to work on. It may be useful to keep out a pad of paper or an open Word document, as some of these reflections are actually part of the Blackboard activities. As a graduate student, we're not creative writers. It's not that we wait for inspiration, wait for when we're in the mood. Often, there's a timeline or we have our own motivation and we just have to sit down and get it done. This means, especially since I told you need to write daily, in the first one, is basically that we have to be self-aware. Are we tired? Are we wandering? So one of the things I want you to consider that might help you be a more effective editor of your own work is to color code when you feel that you're tired or aren't focused. By color coding these, instead of starting at the beginning, most people start by revising, right? That first paragraph. Well, we start with revising the first paragraph, and that means all of our attention tends to get directive, right? That best time, the time we're most engaged, tends to be focused on the first few words of the document. By the end, especially if we're still revising at the same time, we lose steam. So rather than just always working on that first paragraph, consider that if you color code when you're feeling tired, that this might be a way of saying, okay, let's start revising here. Here's a point at which I was more likely to make mistakes, so I'm going to start by putting my intention there. Another time that's probably a good idea to kind of mark down is when you're really focusing on looking at a particular text. Because if we're staring at a particular text and we're trying to paraphrase, chances are at these moments we're more likely to have inadvertent plagiarism, right? We're more likely to have words copied. So one way that can be useful is to have a different code for saying, okay, this is when I was staring at the book, where you sort of found yourself slipping into maybe almost writing a quotation when your goal wasn't to do that. By having this color coded, you can go back and revise with the text and make sure that your work is either got the sufficiently different from the original text, or you can consider that, okay, have I quoted what I need to quote? Personally, the thing that I like to highlight for myself is when I feel like my ideas are a roller coaster, that they're twisting, that I realize I'm kind of repeating myself here, or no, this idea still needs to be expanded, but I can't quite do it. So when I'm dealing with new material and I find that I don't completely have full understanding of it, I try to note to myself, because that's when I'm going to have to go back and really do structural editing, making sure that, okay, does this flow? Is this the best order? Have I gone and maybe explained definition in the 4th paragraph when really that definition should have been starting off right at the beginning? So for me, I try to have notes to myself for when, okay, here was when I was doing writing, some of this stuff is good, but really for a reader to follow it, it's going to need to be completely restructured. Now, by doing this, at least I save myself some time, so that when I at least start, I know I'm going to spend, those really productive moments while focusing on these areas, rather than maybe hitting them midway or to the end of the time that I'm spent revising and being overwhelmed.
When it comes time to write, I generally grab a pen and a notebook or draft copy of my work and get as far away from the computer as possible. I'm an analog person in a digital world. I find by getting away from the computer, I can concentrate on the work at hand. I'll find a table in a high traffic area, someplace with a lot of white noise. but nothing too specific to distract me, like a food court or hotel lobby, and I'll write until I've finished what I'm working on or I run out of time. I find this way I'm focused on the page in front of me and I can get my thoughts on paper. I save my editing for later when I type out my notes.
There are many strategies and processes that you can use to revise your work, and many of them are going to be really dependent on what kind of errors you see yourself repeatedly making, or maybe there's a particular challenge. But my goal and kind of what's going to follow in the majority of this workshop is to give you a sense of where I've found in my own work and working with other graduate students areas that tend to be weaker. Because the documents that we write in graduate school are more complex, we're dealing with challenging ideas, we're often trying to construct ideas as we go along, that often the order in which we put things in tends to mirror the order in which the ideas came to us, maybe perhaps the order in which we read the material. And so often, while the method of organization seems really clear and apparent to us, it's not to someone else. So key in looking at kind of the organization of your work is to consider this idea of who is reading it. So recognize that perhaps you developed a new idea midway through your paper, because as you're writing, you're thinking about it, you're getting inspiration. But having that midway in the paper may really throw off your reader. So because the ideas are more complicated, because the work we're doing is more sophisticated, we need to almost oversimplify our organization and make it really, really transparent, as well as really logical flow between. So it's something that we have to be really conscious of. Now, many people feel like they use, 1.1 heading, then 1.2 heading, that this is going to create sort of the organization or increase clarity. However, if between 1.1 and 1.2 there's this huge jump, it doesn't matter that you've given us this heading. All you've sort of said, it's like a little street sign saying, hey, you're on this street, not say, okay, how did I get here? How did that last section set me up for this section? So keep that in mind, that headings aren't necessarily the one thing that's going to keep a cohesive and well-organized document, that you may actually have to plan to step back and really consider the order of the ideas. You may find that this requires you to kind of reread your document and just make notes of how the ideas are presented, and then are there strong relationships between them? Is this the best order of ideas? So when you're considering the time you're spending for revising, please consider that you may be spending a fair amount of time just looking at the organization of the document before you get into some of the lower, more surface level concerns. One of the key building blocks for basically any written document are the paragraphs. Now, there aren't any really strict rules about how long a paragraph should be, how short a paragraph should be. In most sort of high school level English classes, we're often told, right, one idea per paragraph. However, you're in graduate school, right? One idea, that could be your whole paper. So we need to sort of look at, okay, are there subtopics? Are there groupings? How can we sort of make kind of a manageable bite? A manageable amount of information. So one thing that's kind of key to understanding paragraphs is to realize that as much as they organize the information by sort of separating things out, they are really visual indicators of organization. So there's some things about sort of their visual organization that can give you kind of a tip. You want to have a paragraph be present in the page. There's nothing more terrifying for a reader than to see a whole page of text with no paragraphs. it screams to the reader, and particularly to me, because it really terrifies me when I see this, is that you aren't sure how you organize your ideas. The other thing to consider is that short paragraphs sometimes cue to the reader that your ideas aren't fully developed. So having a 1-sentence or a 2-sentence paragraph might suggest that there's more to that idea there, or that that paragraph should be attached to something else. So really consider how the paragraph, in one way, you can just see how do they look? How does it feel? How would it be for someone else? Haven't read anything to look at the paper. Does it demonstrate visually a sense of organization? There are two really kind of simple techniques that you can do to kind of get a sense of where your paragraphs need revision, or if it seems right. One is to just sort of do that visual look through, to look through the paragraphs and say, okay, what one seems really short, what one seems really long, you know, which ones seem to sort of have those extremes, what are the outlier paragraphs? And by looking at the outlier paragraphs, it gives us an opportunity to sort of say, okay, if these don't fit into the norm, is there anything going on here? The other idea that works really well, and it ties into topic sentences too, is to really try to reverse outline your paper, which means basically, can you summarize in one kind of sentence, one little tweet to yourself, what the topic or the purpose of that paragraph is? By doing it, sort of like each tie in a train track, right? Each sort of little bit, does that tie well into the next one? And so by able to sort of giving yourself this sort of heading or topic-based outline for every paragraph, you can then sort of play with the order of the ideas. So it allows you to step back a little further and say, okay, is this the best order? And I find a lot of people who do reverse outlining sometimes go, I have no clue what that paragraph is about. Or, I think it's just the same thing that I said over there. So it allows you to look for repetition. And remember, if you can't figure out what the paragraph is about, and you wrote it, what chance does the reader have? So if you can't easily, like really quickly tell you, aha, that's what this is about, you know that you haven't made it easy to follow. It's not clear enough to the reader. And consider, okay, what can I do? Where am I kind of getting lost? Do I need a topic sentence? Is it that this is not the best place for it? Perhaps it's where your ideas were all over the place and maybe you just want to put that paragraph aside and say, okay, maybe I've talked about this in other places. I want you to think back to the last major assignment, document, it could be for work, that you were involved in creating. And I want you to think for a moment about how long it took to create that. Was it a process of a day, weeks? Were you working at it over months like you will with your dissertation or thesis? What you find is that we often don't sit and write everything down in one setting. Right? We don't sit down, perfect, here's my dissertation, I wrote it in 12 hours. Rather what happens is, right, we work on it in various times, we take breaks, we come back to it. And not often do we kind of come back and say, okay, let me read back from page 1. Maybe we read the previous paragraph, but we kind of just jump back in. Because this document is created over time, one of the things that can be a weakness in graduate level writing, just because of the labor, the time, the thinking, is the coherence within the document can be quite weak. So what I'm going to offer in the next few slides is to look at a couple techniques that you may want to consider that will help you develop this coherence. So to go back and to sort of look for when, perhaps, you have either failed to do this and could implement these techniques. So let's look at how you can build some coherence amongst your whole document. So to have a really strong, coherent document, we should continually use the same vocabulary or the same words. I know many people, especially if you studied English as a second language, at some point someone marked you for vocabulary. So in this way, at some point someone said, no, you need to change the words, and you would get a better mark if you used more vocabulary. However, this is not true at the graduate level. Repeating the same word is so much better. Because if you first describe something as a process and then later describe it as a procedure, implicitly the reader will think they're different. Because if they were the same, you would use the same word. Right? So if you talk about the process of extracting blah blah blah, and then you go the procedure of something, we won't think they're the same thing because you've used a different word. So therefore, it must be distinct. It must be different. So often when I talk about this idea, I usually get someone who's like, but won't this get boring? Won't it make it seem like my writing is too simple? Simple is good. Because remember, we're dealing with the more complicated the ideas, we need to simplify the writing. We want to simplify the writing so it is easy to follow. So, yeah, it's great. Use the same words because you're using all sorts of terminology that is large and complex. You may have jargon in your field, right? You may be just constantly using different terms to refer to forms of a chemical. That in itself is going to add a whole bunch of complexity. So, we might as well then use, where we can, the same words. And don't be afraid to repeat that same word at the beginning of the next sentence. And in this way, you're going to build coherence just by the fact that you consider and continually use that same kind of word. So if you have a product that comes out of your experiment, keep using product. Similarly, consider how you've addressed what you've been working on. Did you call it a project, paper? You want to make sure that throughout you've used the same term, because the more varied vocabulary that is applied to the same concept, the harder it is for the reader, because every time they see it, they think it's different, and then now they have to go, okay, this also refers back to here. So we want to make this cognitive complexity, right? This cognitive requirement for a reader, we want to simplify that so that then they engage in other things rather than spending all this time focused on trying just to understand what we're saying. If you happen to be going through all these workshops in order, you probably will know that I've already highlighted this when talking about literature reviews, when talking about research proposals. But just for one last time, the virtues of present tense. This depends on your discipline. There are some disciplines that prefer to write everything in the past tense, but the majority of them have switched over to using the present tense. What happens, however, is we write these documents over time. We often start, right? We start at the beginning with setting out what we're going to do and go on. So often it'll start with will, I will discuss this, I will address, and then it ends with discussed. Or, okay, I will contribute, I contributed. What happens though is you make it seem as throughout your document, time has passed. And yes, time has passed for you, the writer. Weeks, maybe months. If you really sort of have a long process, it may be a year or two for writing your dissertation. But for the reader, the time is much more compressed. So ideally, them reading your document will not take them years. So therefore, you can't start with future tense and then move to past tense. Stick to the present tense. It will be difficult when talking about your methodologies possibly, or your findings, but typically if you just go through and just make it present tense and then look at the document as a whole, you'll find that there's this sense of coherence just in the way that the tone has been consistent. In addressing past work, so talking about your articles, sources, note that these two can be addressed in the present tense, because when you read them, it was the present. Even if they were written, back in 1955, For you, the book was present. So consider looking through your verbs and ensuring that they're all in the present tense. This will build another layer of coherence in your document. I wish someone had told me many years earlier than I found out that verbs make all the difference in English. A good verb covers many other words, adverbs, adjectives. So consider having verbs that construct meaning. By this, my focus here is to say, look, if we have a verb that actually doesn't say, says, has, gets, but rather, okay, it includes, the idea shapes, this idea that the person proposes, posits. These all give me a sense that a hypothesis is going on, right? Posed, posits. And therefore, they convey so much more meaning than if we use these state of being verbs. So one way to add coherence and increase the conciseness in the way that you write is to look at the verb and to have a verb that does something. Have people do things in your writing. That way you can use less words, but in fact they'll be more of a punch. So one way to revise your document is to really look at the tense of your verbs, but also look and saying, are people doing something? Because if they're proved something, if something is proved, that's great. Tell me that. If they concluded. Again, all of these words add, my favorite being highlighted or highlighting. I use that one a little too much, so watch for them. And on the handout, there's a list of some of these verbs. On our website, the Writing Support Services, you'll find a Using Sources handout that has a great number of verbs. So you can start with your favorite one and then go back and look. So one way to sort of talk about someone's argument is to say, you know, Smith justifies his conclusion by. So really think about engaging verbs because they'll give a real sense of action, movement, people doing things in your own writing. So as a little change of pace, I thought we could also talk about something that, rather than always including, that you could remove from your work. To add coherence and overall clarity to your work, consider the idea of removing the negative statements. By this I mean, let's get rid of the no, don't, not, those kind of negatives. And rather than setting up a sentence to say, they do not have, use, I know, I'm going to say it again, a verb that conveys that idea. So instead of saying they don't have a lot of money, you can say they lack money. So we can use a verb that already has sort of that negative connotation to it and get rid of the no's and nots. By telling people what it is instead of what it isn't, you're reducing again that cognitive complexity in your writing and making it in a way in which it is much more manageable. These words are of much debate, and it can vary amongst different people on how much you should use them. In some ways, using these words can create transition, but at the same time, in a really complex sentence and these ideas that adding this or these, you're asking the reader to remember what this stands for. I'm not going to give you the word, I'm going to give you something else and say, can you remember back? So you can see how this can add some complexity to the writing. Now on occasion this can help. These words can create links, but when you're dealing with really complex ideas, or really even that moment where you're maybe unpacking a whole bunch of ideas, you want to reduce the number of these words. So think about, this, these, it. is kind of working two ways, right? When we're dealing with ideas that are maybe more obvious, simpler, then they can work really well to create transitions. But, and here is the big but, in any case, you need to easily be able to identify the antecedent or what it stands in for. If you can't, the reader has no chance. So often, two sentences that are really related, the experiment, blah, 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 and then you go this experiment, so to suggest that it's the same one. However, if you're using a number of these, and you're using them a lot, what you're actually doing is you're saying, by the way, can you remember what this word stands for, and this word stands for, and this word stands for? And just repeating that word is going to make it a lot easier for the reader to move on. You're asking them to do less work, to recall less information. Because we write our documents over weeks, months, this time frame, we don't become sort of keen observers of everything that we've talked about. What this means is a lot of graduate work can be, in terms of the writing, really repetitive. Because for us to perhaps re-engage with that topic, we end up sort of setting up all that background, all that information of what we've already talked about again, which the reader doesn't know, right? Because the reader is thinking in a shorter time frame. So if you want to have greater coherence in your document, actually remove repetition. Make sure you only sort of say those key arguments at one point in one section, and don't drag them into other parts where perhaps they don't belong. You go, how does that help coherence? What it does, though, is it says, allows the reader to know when to leave an idea behind and engage in a new one. If you keep threading or going back to other points, for the reader, that overall structure, your organization, and this repetition becomes really difficult for the reader to follow. So consider that both on an organizational level, but even in terms of sort of looking at, are we even using words that mean the same thing in the same sentence? That this focus on getting rid of the unnecessary, that repetition allows more space for the new, for the key ideas. So consider this, that we want to remove repetition because in many ways it's distracting. I apologize to those of you who are the expert at sentences. However, I find that in graduate writing, there are a couple areas where errors tend to really pop up. I find this happens in terms of sentences and then in terms of use of punctuation. I think that the kind of root of this is we're dealing with complex material, we see relationships, so it becomes really hard to figure out, okay, when is the sentence done? And then to kind of make it all of one sentence, sometimes we can have some creative use of punctuation that doesn't really follow the guidelines. And I'm hoping as we go into the punctuation section to actually offer you some ways in which we can actually use punctuation to avoid sentence level errors and also be really much more efficient and concise in the way in which we explain things. Maybe commas are just confusing, but I find commas just happen to be sort of this thorny issue, and that often commas create sentence level errors. And the most common one is basically using a comma when you really have two separate sentences. Okay, this is the comma splice. They're living together when they really shouldn't be. They need to be in two separate locations. The nice thing about comma splices is that when you find them, they are really easy to fix. And the analogy that I find really helpful to remember with comma splices is to consider that they are two sort of people to full adult sentences, independent sentences, living together in kind of sin. They're not supposed to be living together. What do you do in that situation? Well, these two people shouldn't be living together. Well, the first one, in a kind of very traditional way, would say, okay, you can live together, but only if you get married. And that's where we put in that and. We put in a conjunction. Now they're married, they are allowed to live in one sentence. Now, maybe these two people, they're friends. So, that's fine. They can live in the same sentence. We just have to build a wall. We'll put in that semicolon and we'll build a wall, and now we know, yes, they live in the same apartment, but they have two separate bedrooms. And the other solution is, well, if these two sentences are living together and they're not allowed to live together, well, sorry guys, you have to live apart. And we just cut them apart with a period. May seem a little silly, but if you can do the married, roommates, separated kind of idea, that can help you figure out all the different ways to fix comma splice. If the two sentences are very short, you might find that you want to use the conjunction. If they're somewhat longer, they may be a little bit unmanageable, but it really pains you, like to separate them, it just feels wrong, you can use the semicolon. Just use them sparingly, but you can use the semicolon. Otherwise, if there's not a strong relationship between them, it is easier for the reader to understand if you just separate them. The sentence fragment. This is another error that tends to creep in. And basically what happens is, if we think about that we have full sentences, these kind of independent ideas, they can live on their own. We also have dependents, like children are dependents, and they can't live on their own. So a sentence fragment basically is an irresponsible parent. There is a dependent child sentence all alone, and it just can't be, right? So when we consider looking for sentence fragments, one way we can do is say, we're going to often find these as the really short sentences. They're going to be, we have all these other ones, they seem to be consistent length, and we see this really short one. Often that's a good time to go and look at that part and say, okay, does it have all the requirements of an independent full sentence? Meaning, we must have a subject and a verb, and often an object. Now, if subject, verb, and object starts to seem a little bit scary, another way to do is say, okay, put in your possible sentence fragment at the end of this sentence. So is it true that, such as business, engineering, and science courses? In this case, it sounds weird. Doesn't work. So a full sentence will work in the is it true that test. If it doesn't work, you know you have a sentence fragment. Well, they're children, right? They're dependents. How do you solve it? Just find its parent. Usually, it's the sentence before or the sentence after. Once it's got a parent, your dependent clause is going to be happy. The run-on sentence, when we think about it in terms of like a technical rule, it's basically a comma splice without the comma. Two full sentences stuck together. Colloquially, often people will use the term run-on sentence to basically talk about a sentence that is either really long, poorly organized, where the person gets lost. Run-on sentence often gets used for the equivalent of sentences that just seem to go on and on and on and talk really quickly and oh my gosh, I don't know what's going on. That's the verbal equivalent of a run-on sentence. So for the technical definition, we're going to find that the same rules apply as they do for the comma splice, right? So there we can marry them, roommates, separate them. When faced with the kind of colloquial run-on sentence, that sentence that is overwhelming and poorly organized, you may find that in fact that's going to take looking at what was my point, what was my key argument, those massive sentences. The best suggestion I can give you when you have that kind of really long, overwhelming sentence is to start the sentence with the subject. What are you talking about? And then add a verb. Subject-verb combo will help simplify most run-on sentences. Often they're run-on because we keep adding other little pieces of information that distract the reader from being able to figure out what we're actually talking about. for a lot of writers, and myself when I was sort of starting off in graduate school, that punctuation seems scary. They seem like these tools, these keys that we know are there, we've made the happy faces, and now we see them in our reading. We see in the articles that we're reading, people are using them, and we think, we need them, we need to be sophisticated. Now, other than sort of just telling you some of the rules associated with punctuation, I want you to consider here that in many ways, what punctuation marks do is actually offer a visual organization of the sentence. So, by where you put a comma, by using a semicolon, you're actually cueing the reader in how to read the sentence. How have you organized it? Sort of a cue to the syntax or the importance of ideas. So as the starting point, I want to kind of start by looking at, yes, I want to start with the comma. I think if there was sort of a misunderstood punctuation mark, I think it would be the comma. Because he seems to be a substitute for a lot of different punctuation marks. You know, people put in the comma when they mean a semicolon, when they mean a period, when they mean a colon, and all over the place. Some people have been told commas are, you put them in where you take a breath. No. We are not singing here. We do not put breath marks in our writing. They are actually there to tell us how to read the sentence. So we're going to look at sort of three uses of the comma. The comma as the marker of when the sentence starts. We're going to look at sort of the bracketing comma. And then we're also going to look at the comma which sort of cues us that we have two ideas in this sentence. So let's start off with kind of the comma that tells us where the sentence starts. So in this example, we can see that we have sort of an introductory phrase. This is the during, until the end of the Second World War, comma. What comes after this comma is the subject of the sentence. So this comma says, this is kind of warming you up, this is giving you maybe a time, a context for my sentence. But after this comma will come the subject of the sentence. The common error that happens with this comma, it's really not the comma's fault, but is that we end up having multiple introductory phrases. So it no longer works to tell us where the subject of the sentence is when we're starting this complete thought. So people will go, however, comma, until the end of the Second World War, comma. It doesn't work because after that first comma, I'm thinking that's the subject. So make sure that if you're using the comma as a way to tell us where the sentence starts, because you have a little phrase at the beginning, that you only have one. You can't have two phrases at the beginning of the sentence, otherwise the comma's ability to cue me that, hey, this is the main idea, this is the subject of the sentence, dissipates. This has to be my favorite use of the comma, the kind of bracketing comma. Mainly because I hate to see brackets in writing. I don't mind a bracket if it's telling me, okay, this is an acronym, this is a citation, but some people like to put dashes or put in a whole bunch of brackets all over the place, and I find that a bit distracting. So rather, I like to use the comma in this way. So if we look at the first one, basically, we finish our idea, comma. Often this is associated with which. And we're giving you some extra information. We're giving you extra information about whatever that last noun was. So the end of World War II was caused by the atomic bomb, comma, which was created by so-and-so. So that which is giving us extra information in this case about the atomic bomb. Now, this is kind of the which extra information comma. The one that really works as a bracket is where you want to give extra information. It's in the middle of your sentence, but you still want to have that larger idea. So we could say the atomic bomb, dropped on blah, 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 close comma, ended World War II. So we can still read the full sentence without that extra information in the commas. The atomic bomb ended World War II, and that extra information then relates to whatever the previous noun is. The trick for this to work is, like all other brackets, there must be a beginning and an end. So if this is your attempt to really tell me that this is extra information, that I can read this sentence without it, make sure that you have both commas, the opening and the closing one. And this is really the last and probably most boring form of the comma. It's probably the one that we're first introduced to. Basically, we have two full ideas, and to cue us of that, we're going to have both a comma and a conjunction. Comma, but. Comma, so. That kind of idea. It is the conjunction that separates this from a comma splice, so please make sure the conjunction is there. But basically it's cueing us as here's one idea, comma, conjunction giving us a relationship, then here's the other part of it. Yes, we also use ands to separate items in a list, but these three ways that we've talked about using and, in terms of the introductory phrase, extra information, or to link two complete thoughts, these are the ones that really help us organize the sentence so someone else can read it and understand where the information is and how to read it. So if we have the introductory phrase, comma, it's always followed by the subject of the sentence. So it helps us figure out where the subject is. When we look at sort of the which or the extra information use of commas, basically what it's doing is saying, hey, this is information related to the last noun, and it's not crucial for understanding what I'm saying because the complete thought can stand on its own. And the boring one, the conjunction comma, it's basically saying here are two separate thoughts and this is what's relating them together. The simplicity of the apostrophe and how it leads to so much confusion. Maybe it's because, really, if we think about the apostrophe, it's kind of like a superhero. It has its typical day-to-day job, and it kind of has a superpower or an alternative identity. So in this way, an apostrophe, its day-to-day job is possession. Something owns something. On the other hand, it kind of has this secret life or other role in which it says, hey, look, I took away some of the letters. It's omission role. And this is where confusion can happen. One, because I think it's two roles, especially when we write really casually, we can switch between it being possession or omission. Typically, in the writing that you're going to do at the graduate level, you're not going to do omission apostrophes. Don't, can't, won't. These are all omission ones. This is all like, I got rid of the O, look. They're very informal, so we tend to write a little bit more formally. So you're more likely to write do not, cannot, will not, those kind of ideas. Where it can get a little tricky in considering the apostrophe at the graduate level is to really think about the number that we have that's being possessed, that has a possession, that owns something. Because often things like lawyers, as in plural, versus a lawyer who owns something, it's just the position of the apostrophe that dictates if you have a group of lawyers or a single lawyer. So this is where people tend to make the mistake when considering the apostrophe, is not really considering whether it's apostrophe S or it's S with an apostrophe. So keep that as mind as if you have a lot of people owning things, or you want to say, the experiments apostrophe results. Well, the experiments apostrophe result, that means there are multiple experiments that had multiple results. And if in doubt, when you see what this slide shows you, it apostrophe S, just say it is. If it works, then it's right. Otherwise, it with a possessive idea, there's no apostrophe. Sneaky, aren't they, with their double usage? The semicolon. think it's misunderstood. But it can be effective, but people who understand the semicolon perhaps maybe have a tendency to overuse it. So a semicolon, right, it separates two full sentences. Just note that after the semicolon, you don't capitalize. Hence, the full sentence with the lowercase f. The semicolon is useful, right, for those comma splices, those moments in which you don't want to separate the ideas. But please consider them like hot chili peppers. Because cognitively, you're asking me to remember what you said in the first sentence. Well, I'm reading the second one, right? So you're asking me to remember more. You're raising the cognitive complexity. Also, keep in mind that the number of semicolons people like varies. So just like if you were making sort of chili or a really spicy curry, that you have to kind of hit for the lowest heat palette, right? So you may want to use, your chili pepper semicolons really sparingly. And that way, they'll be really effective when you do use them. In comparison to maybe the semicolon who can be sort of pulled out and used a bit more than is useful, the colon. The colon is a beautiful punctuation mark. One that I think anybody who wants to write really clearly and concisely should just grab onto. The colon basically would follow a full sentence, and then either indicates to the reader that you're going to follow this with a quotation or a list. There are a couple tricks to using it properly, but otherwise, it's really a great way to get rid of words that you otherwise would be putting in. So let's talk about it in terms of a list first. If you want to use a colon to indicate a list is coming, you just have to put it at the end of a full sentence. Meaning subject, verb. So I can say, the most popular sandwiches in Canada involve cheese. And then colon, I can list all the types of sandwiches. I don't need such as. A colon can't follow a verb. So you can't say, the ingredients are colon. No, that won't work. That's are as a verb. But we can have this full sentence. And then we can have the list, and we don't have to put such as, for example, that the colon already implies that relationship. I know, you're still thinking about it. I can't have it at the end of a verb. You may be kind of concerned. Don't worry, the phrase the following is not a verb. It's a noun. So you're free to use the following if you want to. It's a little lame. The other thing to keep in mind in terms of colons are, one, you don't capitalize after it unless it's a proper noun. And that colons, lists with colons, tend to be separated by semicolons. But just sort of check with the style guide associated with your citation style, because this may vary. The other way you can use it is to introduce a quotation. Why does this save you time? Well, you don't have to sort of write that transitional sentence to sort of start it off. You can say, Shakespeare often discussed the role of women in society in the play Othello, there's your quote, and then you can unpack that. So we can actually just have a full sentence rather than saying, Shakespeare says, or Shakespeare wrote, and then have a quotation. So we can actually have a more productive statement that gives a bit of a sense of why you're introducing that quotation, go for the quotation. Do bear in mind that with any form of quotation, you need to follow the requirements of your style guide. Sometimes that means special formatting for extra long quotes. Sometimes getting feedback from your supervisor can be a bit overwhelming, especially if you're getting comments both on your contribution to knowledge, your argument, your style, and the correctness of your writing, and it can become overwhelming. So one way that we can kind of deal with that is to start developing kind of a sense of what are we overusing? what's getting a lot of comments on it that maybe are distracting away from the really quality ones on what you're saying. So I'm going to talk about a couple of words or phrases that you can actually just cut out of your writing that may actually avoid some of the commentary you may have been getting. And these are based on my own experience, but also looking at other students' writing and seeing, okay, what are some of the security blanket words that we put in that really aren't adding to our meaning. So one of these sort of sets of words that get plopped into a lot of writing, we think they're adding tons and tons of meaning, that really aren't, are adverbs. These are the adjectives of verbs. If you're not a grammar kind of expert, they tend to end in ly. So these are the substantially, strongly. However, they don't always add meaning to a sentence. Adverbs like strongly in certain situations aren't quantifiable. I don't really know what you mean by strongly. They strongly argue. Is that different than they argue? So often, just getting rid of the adverbs actually makes the statements that you want to emphasize more powerful. So instead of saying it's a strongly argued point, you can just, why don't you tell me, what you mean by strongly? Give me a sense of that, and that will be more powerful. Similarly, very. If you want to say it's a very important article, well, when we speak, that's great. I can go. Very. Can give you a lot of oomph on that word to stress it. Unfortunately, when we read it, it doesn't work that way. It is a very important article. It's actually more powerful just to say it's an important article. That conciseness may actually be more effective than adding these extra words. The times where you might find adverbs necessary is if you're using them to qualify your argument. This is why we use things like generally, typically. We don't want to say every case, but we want to say most of them. So save your adverbs for those situations. And otherwise, go through your find, replace, type in ly, and see how many adjectives you can easily remove from your writing. I had a high school teacher, and he gave us a whole list of words that we weren't allowed to use in our writing. And when I was in high school, I really thought this was arbitrary. Now, don't use good. I didn't really get why this was a problem until I got to graduate school, and then I really started to see why his do not use words were categorized as such. And one thing you really want to consider is, are you putting words in your sentences that really don't add to meaning? And that was part of his list. So he said you can't use the word thing. The word thing, there's always one that's more specific, so don't use it. I would say, some of our kind of ideas of quality that we generally speak with, good, bad, great, big, they don't work. They don't really add anything to the sentence. There are better words to use. Similarly, don't use utilize. Utilize sounds so fancy, but in reality, use works just as good. And also think about some of the words that we use in language when we speak because we can stress them. I can say it was extremely important, or I'm really tired. Yes, I can say them that way, but when I'm writing, that doesn't carry over. The really actually dilutes what I'm trying to say. And then there are words that we use that are redundant. Redundant because we've already put in a word that means the same thing. So think about the phrase past history. History has already passed. It would not be history if it hadn't passed. So when we're doing these things, and unfortunately they're really common phrases that you pick up, but they're not needed. So if we think of, the idea of an end result, well, the result is the end. So look through and say, okay, am I using, two words or a pair of words when really one is sufficient? And actually, by removing these words, okay, you're allowing sort of your reader to focus on what you're saying, because by adding these words, right, you're just making more space, more text for them to have to get through to get to your point. So consider that perhaps instead of talking about a particular interest, realize that an interest is already particular. And here I am willing to admit that I have fallen victim to the illogical phrase. In particular, one that, after being noted several times, I did catch up on, is the idea of you can't center around something. Around is not centered. There's a conflict. So these illogical phrases, though again, they're often used, in fact, kind of create an underlying kind of disconnect or confusion in your writing, especially if we're using them really frequently, right? How can the idea center around? It's not working. Consider too some of the times that we often talk about, having an accurate estimate. It's an estimate. It's an estimate based on the fact that it isn't accurate. So as you're going through your revising, you may want to check and say, okay, do I have some phrases that really don't work, that there's a really kind of discord in? And keep track of them. At least then, if you have a list of them, right, you can go to your find your place, which I go for. I go for find, show me all my center, and then at least I can delete the around and get rid of that one kind of reoccurring error in my own work. When you're going in back and revising your work, another thing that you want to keep in mind is to really make sure that your words aren't ambiguous. By this, there are often words that we use such as further, where applicable, but we have to make sure that when we say things like where applicable, that we actually set up what makes it applicable. Often we'll put these things in like normally, generally, and we won't really set the conditions that are required to really understand when, under what context you consider it to be general. So consider this as well, that some words where we have a sense of what we're trying to get across with them may not be apparent to your reader. In those situations, when you're going back and revising, you may want to say, okay, can I put this in something that is more grounded, that will be clear to everyone, rather than, let's say, a phrase that kind of leads to something that's unclear or perhaps an ambiguous situation.
Working on a long document can sometimes seem like a daunting task. I find that when I am editing this work, I need to make several passes, attending to different things each time. However, two major concerns that I return to over and over again are meaning and logic. I will look at each section in isolation and ask myself this question: what is my point here? This addresses my intention and helps me clarify my meaning. What am I trying to say in this section of the paper, and have I actually done that? This is where the logic comes in, as I need to track my argument and make sure I haven't left anything out, assuming it is implicit in my other comments. I almost always find that I have missed a link or two. Sometimes this is because I haven't clearly defined my terms, or I haven't laid out clearly how one idea connects to the next idea. As well, I will often find as I go through each section of the paper that there are overlapping ideas in different sections. This becomes an opportunity to decide if I need to move a paragraph or two from here to there, or whether I need to redefine what a particular section is really about. This is a further refining of the meaning and logic aspects that I just mentioned, but is now addressing how it works throughout the document as a whole. Okay?
So since we've talked about words to avoid or words that we should be very careful with in terms of editing in our work, I want to talk about another set of words that we often misuse. Now, I'm only going to talk about a few that I find most often arise in graduate writing, but there are a wide range of these. So, keep in mind that there are all sorts of resources that you can use depending on these kind of words. What I drew from was Common Errors and Problems in English by Robert Allen. There's also books entitled Right, Wrong, and Risky. So keep in mind that this is not going to encompass everything, but if you have a feeling that misusing words might be happening to you, go grab a lot of these resources. They can be very helpful and to tell you, okay, when should I use them? And some of them, when we speak, we often use them interchangeably, but when we write, we need to add that level of clarity. Now, sometimes when we're writing in academic writing, we want to seem formal. Sometimes maybe we want to demonstrate our knowledge by sounding fancy. So we can say, this is an apt solution. However, apt doesn't work in this context. Apt is something that ties to aptitude. It ties to a natural occurrence, a natural ability. So therefore, applying it to a solution won't work well. Sometimes we also like to talk about, well, it's liable to happen. Okay, this says that there may be a negative consequence that's going to come out of it. So you don't want to say that it's liable that will have a positive result, because liable already carries that sort of negative consequences. Often, we're using apt, liable, because we really want to say, look, we're talking about probability, and we want to say that there's a positive probability. So in most of the work that you're going to be doing, chances are you're going to use a likely, and rarely use the other two, unless perhaps you're in psychology and you want to talk about students and their capabilities, then you might use apt. Liable, perhaps maybe if you're talking about geographical negative consequences or a disease or an explosion, but chances are, stick with likely. Here's another example that always kind of messes me up. Maybe it's because when we say them, they're so simple and they're so similar. Assure, insure, insure. So when we read things out loud, often, if we're trying to hear for errors, we won't hear them with these combination of words. So let's think about assure. If you want to assure someone, basically, you're promising them the results. You can assure them that everything will be okay. So this is often more of an emotive kind of word. Similarly, insure with an I, well, unless you're going to become an insurance agent, you're not going to be insuring anything, okay? So really, in most situations, you should be looking for the and combination. Because to insure, right, you're to make certain. So consider that though they're very similar, each one has a slight different change in meaning. And if you happen to maybe use them interchangeably, this can create some confusion in the reader. I don't quite want to give you the answer to this one. Most people have a sense. Just keep in mind, okay, that in this case, between, among, we're dealing with numbers. Between can only be between two and only two options. Among typically is used for 3 or more, but it can also be used with 2 if you really want to. But consider that when you talk about something between, make sure that there are only 2 options. It's kind of like a bridge over a river. In this case, we only want to talk about between the 2 shorelines. So if the first ones are seeming a little bit easy, now we're starting to get into the more complex. And a lot of the ones that we're going to talk about are going to be particularly useful for people who are describing a method, an experimental model, where you have time and different steps. So let's consider the case of continual versus continuous. Do you think you know the solution? Think that, okay, continuous means that basically you start and end without interruption. Okay, continual means that this process is happening over and over and over again. So, we can say that you have a continuous process. We start, go through everything, and end, no interruptions. Continual, this is when you want to talk about something that's recursive. So we continually go back to the beginning. We continually read the book, which suggests that not that we read it from start to finish, that would be continuous. Continually reading actually suggests that we keep rereading over and over again. So you can see how just this simple difference can actually have a big impact on how someone else would understand perhaps your experimental method. Are you saying that you don't no stops, or are you saying that this is a process that repeats and repeats and repeats? However, oh, this is a sneaky word. Mainly because for a lot of the situations we actually use it incorrectly. And there are some debates about how you can use however, but there's one thing it does not do. However is not a conjunction. You can't use it like you would but, and, so, for, yet. Can't use it the same way. So if you want to use however, consider that maybe you want, instead of a comma beforehand, to put a semicolon. That would make it 2 full sentences. Consider also when you're using however, that perhaps you might not want to start your sentence with that. Some people find however at the beginning of a sentence to be a little bit unsettling because you're already starting with, hey, remember what I already said. So in this case, here's a great chance to actually include a semicolon, and then you can use it like a conjunction even though it's not really one. Here's another one that probably might give you a challenge when you're thinking about writing your results section. And this is, it seems that infer, imply, fairly similar. Except, imply is weaker. Why? Well, imply is more general. Okay, it doesn't have a systematic nature to it. It's sort of like, well, I think, seems to, suggests, whereas infer actually talks about a pattern where you're making conclusions from evidence. So you don't want to say that your results imply this solution. You might want to say that you infer from your results this conclusion. So keep that in mind that, if you have evidence, you want to infer. Leave implying for those other weaker situations. Here's another one where intense, intensive, that they actually do have significantly different meaning. But when we speak, we tend not to have this. So if we think about intense, we're talking about extreme, right? So it was an intense experience. When we talk about intensive, such as intensive care, we're actually looking at a particular point. So you can have an intense situation, but when you talk about intensive, you might talk about, okay, I'm going to intensive training on SPSS. So therefore, you're focusing on one point in a great deal of depth versus kind of a sense of extreme. I'm a big fan of reading my work out loud to help me sort of listen for errors. And this one, again, maybe, I can say them both. You can't hear the difference, right? You're not sure if there's a space there or not. So, one solution is to actually read out the sentence and instead of, whichever version of maybe you have, put in could be. This outcome may be a problem. Which one do I use? Well, does this make sense? This outcome could be a problem. Could be works, then we're looking for 2 words, not the combined maybe. So, am I partly done my dissertation or am I partially done my dissertation? Which one works? You think you got it? We're looking at partially. Because in this case, we're looking at the process, right? We're looking at, okay, I haven't finished, I haven't completed it. Versus when we're looking with partly, we're saying, okay, this is one aspect of a whole. It's not as strongly tied, okay, to this idea of a verb. So remember that partially tells us when a process isn't complete. It's been started, but not complete, whereas partly tells us, okay, it tells us that, okay, we're looking at one aspect, but this is a larger issue. So then we could say the solution for global warming is partly to reduce vehicle emissions. So we're saying it's not the whole thing, it's only one piece. And we add that I when we're talking about a process, something that's a process that's not been finished. Some of you may remember that you've got a pal in your principal. So your principal being the person, right? Just to give you an idea that the pal connects you with a person. Now, the reason that this comes up, I think, sometimes in graduate writing is because really we don't get any help from spell check on this one, right? Both principal, principal, you can actually use them in the same situation. They both function as nouns. So really this one you're gonna have to keep an eye on. Chances are that you're not talking about a pal, that in fact you're talking about a fact, a theory, an idea. So keep that in mind, that chances are you're looking for principal, not principal. So hopefully at some point you've learned the difference between two words that perhaps you didn't really think about that carefully. And we only have 3 more. But these are particularly interesting, because often we use interchangeably proved and proven. There you go. That's pretty, you want to use them in both cases. The key really here is very simple. ED equals verb. So if you want to use it as a verb, if there's an action going on, the action being, to prove, then use ED. Use proven when you want an adjective, the proven formula. So when you have this proven, you want to make sure that you're actually describing a noun and not using it as a verb. Unfortunately, we're looking at one word difference at the end, and this is where people are likely to get confused. So keep that in mind, that that little D and N can create a little confusion if we're not really looking really carefully at our writing. Often when we look at recipes, they often say that we can substitute different ingredients. So if you don't have currants, you can substitute them with raisins. The reason we can use substitute or have a substitution is because implicitly in that recipe they're saying, okay, ideally or typically you would use currants, but in absence of currants, we can add raisins. This is different than replace. Okay? When we replace something, it's not a choice change, it means we don't have something. So we don't have something, so we have to actually fill it in with this alternate. Okay? So replace is often when something is depleted, something's missing. Substitution has this notion that there is an ideal type, okay, that is absent. So often substitution tends to be more specific, replace tends to be more general. And I like ending with this one, mainly because it's somewhat mysterious. If you read your work out loud and you switch that and which, often you're not going to hear a difference. Yet, depending on the situation, Word will often tell you, nope, you need that. Nope, you need which. The key thing to keep in mind here is which is usually has a comma in front of it. So which tends to follow a comma saying, look, this is extra information about something. That, okay, referring to that, it's a naming situation. So if I say, the cat that sat on my hat, okay, if that's the beginning of my sentence, I'm identifying the cat through what is associated with the that, okay? What cat? It's the cat that sat on my hat. So, hence, because it's a naming association, right, it clears up the noun that comes before it in terms of which out of many, we use that, and there's no comma because it's essential to the sentence. Remember a little bit earlier where we talked about kind of the bracketing comma? That can't be used with the bracketing comma because it's essential. Whereas the information in the bracketing commas, remember, we could just read the sentence without it. So keep that in mind. Is the information crucial for understanding what you're talking about? Is it essential? If it's essential, chances are you want that and no comma. If it's not essential, it's not naming or clearing up something, then use which and don't forget the comma. Well, now that you know a whole bunch of words that seem similar but really aren't interchangeable, we can talk about creating an overall strategy of revision. The best way, and probably to be the most efficient person when revising, is to really have a sense of, okay, what are the errors I tend to make between all the documents? What reoccurs? You know, what is the pet peeve that your supervisor always circles and says, when are you going to figure out how to do X? By creating a common error checklist, the one thing it can do is it allows you to go through your work focused on just one thing and actually reduce the mistakes that tend to create the most errors. So for example, I find it hard when I'm writing. I'll put particularly when I mean particular. I'll put importantly when I mean important. So I have a whole series of words where, you know, if I add an ly, that's often extra to the situation. So then I know when I go through my document that I may want to go through and just sort of search for, you know, part. And then look, okay, do I mean particularly? Do I mean particular? So in this way, it helps me be a lot more efficient and going through for key errors. You may find that you have a habit of writing basically gigantic sentences, you know, looking at tsunami-sized sentences. Well, then you know one of the things you can do is look for long sentences and then go through your whole document just looking for that error. The most efficient revisers tends to be the people who are really self-aware of the kind of errors they make and who recognize that it's easier to look for one error at a time than to keep reading through your whole document, beginning to end, looking for everything. So we're going to talk about a few techniques, a few things you can do to engage with your writing that'll help you catch more errors, but fundamentally being reflexive, keeping track of the errors that tend to come up will actually help you in the long run. I used to write a lot of sentences backwards. I'd start with the information that was sort of key to me and then sort of build back to the argument. Over time, I kept revising for those sentences. Now, when I start a sentence off with T-H-O, I go, oh, I think I'm writing the word though. I realize for me that's a cue. That's what most of my backward sentences started with. That now it's the point where I don't write those sentences as often. By looking for the same things over and over again, eventually this actually translates into your composition. When you'll start to go, oh, I think I'm making that mistake. So keep the checklist. Chances are the more you revise for the same things, the less likely you are to make those errors in the long run when you write in the first place. There have been a lot of studies done, and they look at, okay, what are the differences between people who are really familiar with the document to people who are less familiar? What kind of errors do they pick up? People who are familiar with the document It's a great time to revise for content, sometimes for structure, but when it comes to smaller surface level errors, typographical errors, verb subject agreement, the closer you are to when you've written it, the less likely you are to find them. This is why when you hand your paper to someone else and they go and they find all the errors, you see them. You're like, I think my printer's broken. They weren't there when I looked at the page. So key to following on that idea is to use time really efficiently, especially for working on larger projects. Okay, you're wondering, how do we use it efficiently? Don't feel like you have to start a draft, write that chapter, fix that chapter, send it off. Consider that it may actually be more effective to write the chapter, go and revise the previous chapter, then write, so you can alternate in your composition styles. So consider that being an effective reviser sometimes means thinking a little outside of the box, setting up time in between when you've written something and when you look at it. And that may just save you, in the long run, time when you're revising, so you're not going through things over and over again. Now, this is the ideal. Sometimes there are deadlines, and deadlines impinge on our ability to leave it for a while before we go and revise it. And this is where having a friend, a colleague, even a writing tutor take a quick look at it can actually help, because we can be your reader. We can be that extra pair of eyes that asks you questions or sort of goes and gets you to focus on your writing just that little bit more deeply. Few people believe me when I tell them this at first, but if you want to catch more errors and you just want to do one thing, one really simple thing, print it out. We are very efficient readers these days. We're used to reading on screens, we're used to reading quickly, right? Scanning for information. Well, while that skill is great for many, many situations, it harms us when we're trying to edit on a screen. Spend the money, kill the trees, and print it out. Looking at a printed copy, you will just find more errors than if you did at the screen. For example, when you're on the screen, have you ever noticed how tiny the difference between a comma and a period is? Right? It's really hard to tell the difference. It's easier when it's printed out. And if you are just firmly against using paper, then consider that for you to revise, you're going to need to really bump up the size. So you may want to have a 300% field when you're actually looking at your Word document. So that way you can't skip ahead, you can't rush through. But really, the one thing you can do out of all of this discussion is to really think about printing it out. Guarantee you'll find more errors every single time. As you recall, when I was talking about, commonly misused words, I said they're troublesome if your revision style is to read your paper out loud, because they sound the same. But for most people, there are a whole slew of other errors that we can catch when we read our papers out loud to ourselves. It may seem a little silly, but when you read out loud, you're slowing yourself down. Think about it. You're actually concentrating on each word on the page, rather than when we're reading silently, right? We skim, we go through quickly, and we're less likely to catch errors. Now, on occasion, some people really cannot read what's on their page. I've met a few people, like I see them try, and they just, even when reading out loud, they manage to read what they think should be there. So if you don't want to read your paper out loud, that's fine. There's a lot of software that will read your paper back to you. So consider this, why not have a slightly creepy computer voice read your paper back to you? Because it will only read what's on the page. So if you're missing a word, or you have the wrong word, maybe you're thinking, oh, I meant to write public, but you forgot the L, it's gonna read the actual word that you've typed on the page. So consider that one of the ways that you can actually revise isn't always simply reading, but actually listening to what you've written. I love computers. I love spell check and grammar check, and I know it's immensely helpful. The only problem is that it's not always right. For example, let's say you start a sentence with a subject that's really long. The concentration of arsenic in local water sources. Yeah, that can be the subject of your sentence. It's really long. And chances are, if that's the subject of your sentence, Word's going to give you that nice kind of little bubbly green line and say, that's a sentence fragment. Really, it's not a sentence fragment, but rather, Word wasn't set up to understand, these long subjects. So sometimes we need to actually not trust spell check, grammar check implicitly and sort of have our judgment override. Similarly, you're going to find that there are lots of terms or terminology in your field that gets underlined in red. So I'm not saying don't use spell check, but your paper, it's not perfect if it doesn't have any red or green in it. Rather, you will have to keep your independence and keep looking and seeing, is it correct? Is the computer able to read the syntax of the sentence? Is it familiar with this word? And recognize that, in fact, spell check, the computer program, is in fact wrong. It can be wrong. And it also doesn't catch a lot of other mistakes. It doesn't catch if you've used the wrong word. So maybe you wanted ostracized, but you actually wrote oyster-sized. It's not going to be able to recognize the difference between those. So keep in mind, be a little skeptical with what Word offers you. It's a great, great tool, but at the same time, we need to still check that it's doing its job. One of the best ways to revise, sometimes the hardest to organize, is have someone else read the paper aloud to you. Don't just send it via email as an attachment. Here's why. Remember when someone sent you a document to edit via email? How much effort did you really put in? Yeah, did you write comments or did you just rewrite sentences? See what I'm getting at here? You'll actually get more bang for the time they're willing to give you if you sit down in person. Have them sit down, read it aloud to you. You can ask them questions, you can get feedback. Did that make sense? What do you think that meant? You can have a lot more interaction in a half an hour of working with someone rather than the other way around, where you just sent them the document and you're relying on them to be fully engaged. Yes, this means that they probably won't go through the whole document, but you should be able to get enough common mistakes, things that are reoccurring, that you can apply to the rest of the document. And how do you kind of get someone to come? Well, you can offer them a drink, offer them a beer, but from my experience, it's often best to buy them that beer afterwards. For during the revision, I find coffee, espresso, might help them focus a bit more than the alcohol. So at this point, I'm hoping that you have the possible starting points of a revision checklist, that you have some strategies that'll help you when looking at your own work. And as you implement, as you sort of reflect on where do I make mistakes, how do I fix these, you're going to become a stronger reviser of your own work overall. And if you can't find someone who's willing to sit down and read your paper out loud, well, you're able to book 2 half-an-hour appointments a week at Writing Services, and you can have a writing tutor be your reader, to be reading it out loud with you and telling you where they get confused, where they find errors. So consider that throughout your graduate career, if writing is something that you're still concerned about after all of the workshops, that we can become a resource to help you build this skill over a longer period of time.